You gotta understand, guys, we usually like deep dive about all these movies individually. So we're trying to sum this all up in like 1 minute of why it's here on the list.
Comprehensive but quick.
What's happening there, Reject Nation? It is the end of the year, and we just cannot end the year without doing this video. We are going to rank our personal favorite of the Spider-Man live-action films, specifically the ones with Tobey Maguire, Tom Holland, and Andrew Garfield. I know some people are putting Venom on their list. Honestly, I feel like if you told someone who doesn't know Venom that it's a Spider-Man movie, and you said it's a Spider-Man movie, then they watch it, they'd be like, you're a freaking liar. There's no Spider-Man here.
The Spider-Man lore.
Because honestly, I feel like if you take like Civil War and Infinity War, that's more Spider-Man movie than freaking the Venom movies are. And no one's putting those on those lists. I did contemplate whether or not doing Into the Spider-Verse, but then ultimately it was like, no, let's just stick with the ones that I think people really want to hear the ranking for, which is the ones, obviously, spoiler alert, the ones that are in Spider-Man No Way Home. So yeah, if you guys could go ahead, leave a like, we'd really appreciate that. Tell us in the comments what your personal ranking is. And like I said, this is personal ranking. I would like to be here and say it's subjective, you know, so people will disagree with what I gotta say, what John's gotta say, but that's boring. This is pure objectivity. You know what? If you don't have the same ranking as us, something's wrong with you. That's what I'm gonna say.
And if our rankings are different, they're both correct.
That's what I'm telling you guys. All right, guys, let's kick it off. So there are 8 movies here. John has his written down. I don't have mine written down. I know it pretty well off the dome. We rewatched them leading into No Way Home. It's funny because most of my ranking really changed a lot upon rewatching it. But for number 8, out of the 8 films, my number 8 would have to be Spider-Man 3. I really enjoyed Spider-Man 3 a lot. I used to like it a lot more when I was younger, but then rewatching it, it's like, I like, you know, Sandman, he's cool, some of the action's all right, but honestly, I just could not emotionally care about like anything that was going on. It never once pulled anything out of me. Is it the most memeable one? Sure.
You'll get your rent when you fix this damn door!
Even the fun really starts to weigh down in the last half hour of that film. Once, you know, Topher Grace gets the symbiote, I just start checking out, and it happens every single time. And it honestly, watching it back to back from Spider-Man 2 to Spider-Man 3, the disappointment factor just hits that much harder. So, yeah, at the bottom of my list would have to be Spider-Man 3.
This is going to be so much fun. Number 8 for me, drum roll, is Spider-Man Far From Home. You know, rewatching both of the Tom Holland movies in preparation, I was very torn. This list for me has changed every day since I've thought about it. And why this one lands at the bottom is mostly because, yeah, there's a lot of fun to be had. There's a lot of, you know, enjoyable humor. There are a lot of enjoyable action set pieces and whatnot. In a lot of ways, I think they're fine. Like, they're really enjoyable. They're very shiny and polished. And this one obviously has a lot to appreciate with Mysterio and whatnot. But for the most part, I feel like this movie is about Peter Parker trying to exist in another movie while a different movie forces itself upon him. While there are some really dazzling sequences, such as the Mysterio sequence, ultimately, it's just not the one I would want to return to before a bunch of the other ones. And even though, yeah, there's some fun to be had, it feels way more like an Avengers movie, or it wants to be an Avengers movie. It's about so many other things that affect Peter Parker, but don't really feel like they're his story definitively to me. So that's why Far From Home's at the bottom.
Well, number 7 for me would be Far From Home. I do agree with all these sentiments. It's funny because I feel like everything from 1 through 7, I actually would say I overall like, you know, like every movie here. That's the part of the powerful thing about the franchise of Spider-Man, is that for the most part, I'm like, even the ones at towards the bottom of the list, I would actually say I do like those movies. Far From Home in particular, I would echo exactly everything that you said. And while I feel like No Way Home retroactively makes Homecoming and Far From Home better films, when you realize like, oh, they're actually kind of doing a bit of an origin tale, I feel like it's a little too much at odds with itself, especially with a lot of the decision making that Peter Parker is doing. I think a lot of tension gets sacrificed for comedy. There's something about the first 2 Tom Holland movies where I just I don't really feel much of an emotional investment until towards the end of those films. Yes. So while fun, while fine, while passable, I don't really buy into the stakes till way later on. I think Peter, like in MJ's left field, even at this point in Peter's life, I have difficulty subscribing to the idea that he doesn't really want to help save the world from an elemental that he's been told can destroy the world, but instead just be on his field trip. Becomes a little too much Iron Man Jr. for my personal taste, and there's a lot of comedy that doesn't quite hit for me, in spite of the fact that I think both Tom Holland and Jake Gyllenhaal give great performances, and how funny I think that is. It mainly just leaves me feeling like it's cute. I still like the movie. It's just not one of my faves.
Yeah, absolutely. And moving on to number 7, it's Homecoming for me. And for similar reasons, I like it better than Far From Home because it is a bit more focused and it is charming to have this sort of Ferris Bueller take on Peter Parker, bringing him into the MCU. But a big part of it for me is I like Tom Holland a lot in this movie, in both of those movies, in No Way Home. As much as we don't need the origin story, there's not enough else around him to endear me beyond just being like, yeah, I like this guy. He's doing good. I think he's a good choice, and yet the material isn't really making him sing. It's not moving me. There are a lot of good and bad in the Spider-Man franchise and often oscillating in the same movie, and I feel like this one for me is pretty pleasant throughout. My favorite thing about it is Michael Keaton. He is the thing that moves the needle most, and everything else is pleasant and likable and arguably, probably objectively better than some of the things that I will list after it. But as an emotional experience, I'm just not that compelled when I think I want to put on a Spider-Man movie to go watch Homecoming.
Yeah. My number 6 is Homecoming. Yeah. With Homecoming in particular on this rewatch, it's weird when I look back at when this movie first came out. I was just so excited at the prospect of Spider-Man being in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but every single time I've rewatched it, I've liked it less and less. I do have a hard time dealing with the fact that it pretty much feels like there's something that solves Peter's problems all the time, whether it be Peter Parker or Spider-Man. Somehow he gets out of the consequences. There's way too much tech. I feel like that's kind of the point. Like I said with Far From Home, this movie gets really interesting towards the end when Michael Keaton does come face to face with Tom Holland, before the homecoming dance. That's when the movie finally gets a little bit of tension and starts feeling like there's some actual stakes. I don't really latch on to Peter Parker's motivation in this film either. Someone was trying to tell me that his whole problem is he doesn't feel like he's good enough and he's trying to aspire to be good enough. And while I can respect that theme that this individual picked up on for their 5th rewatch, I did not personally ever connect to that in the film. Yes, it's funny. It's fine. Honestly, every time I watch it the first 20 minutes, I'm like, actually, maybe I really enjoyed this film. But I really feel like if it wasn't Michael Keaton in the role, I wouldn't give 2 shits about Vulture. I don't find him that interesting of a character in the movie. And I really don't like how he seems to get out of consequential situations with exuberant amounts of help. So the film lacks a certain weight that I found myself craving, and especially after watching Mark Webb and Sam Raimi's films, I find the action and cinematography to just be nowhere near as interesting or exciting. In both films, I do genuinely love the relationship he has with Ned, and I do believe what truly carries these films is Tom Holland's exceptional performance. It's fine, it's lighthearted, it's kid-friendly, feels like the Disney-fied version of Spider-Man.
My next one I deliberated hard on, and I could almost interchange them really, because what it came down to me kind of is a level of tedium. Given where I've started this list, I'm going to put Spider-Man 3 at number 6, partly because I enjoy a lot of that movie, and for my own personal, 100% personal purposes, I might place it one notch higher. However, this movie is, if you want to talk about at odds with itself, I mean, you can feel the studio problems, and it wildly oscillates between stuff that you can tell Sam Raimi really cares about and moments that are so, I love one of my favorite moments across all of cinematic Spider-Man is the Sandman formation sequence. I think there are some really great ideas in the movie. There are some really sweet, touching Peter scenes. I enjoy unabashedly Tobey Maguire. I think that's a reasonable take on who that guy would become if he was trying to be cool. It's got some of the most Dylan Baker, Dr. Connors, which I was really looking forward to seeing. There is stuff that I genuinely enjoy. However, there is also a lot that I enjoyed in the past that then became tedious, characters that started to suffer or get wackier, and yeah, it's the one I would put on for more fun than, say, the next one on my list, but it's in a so bad it's good kind of way, or in a sort of curiosity, how did this go so wrong, and what could have been if it had gone the way maybe the director intended to, sort of thing.
Yeah, I can't even get on board for that first half hour when I'm like, why is Peter so stupid? I get it. His ego's getting to his head. I get what they're going for, but I just cannot buy how insanely naive he would be, especially with kissing boring-ass Gwen Stacy in that movie.
Yeah, there's some frustrating stuff in that movie.
My number 5 would actually be The Amazing Spider-Man 2. If you asked me a few months ago which one would be at the very bottom of my list, it was actually The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I had only seen it 1.5 times when it first came out. I really didn't like it, and as I feel like time has gone on, I think the Amazing Spider-Man series just came out a little too soon, because I don't think people were ready for just such a reboot and a shift so fast in style and tone. And Amazing Spider-Man 2, while it tries to do a little too much, while I think the Green Goblin thing was really unnecessary for this film, film and the finale of it all, how it kind of undercuts the weight and the buildup of Electro. I actually found that on my rewatch, I really enjoyed this film. I think it still advances the story of Peter Parker for what they're doing here. They have some really great emotional beats. I like the scenes with Dane DeHaan and Andrew Garfield. Everything with Gwen Stacy and Andrew Garfield is freaking phenomenal in this movie. I think the action is still really freaking good. I still think the swinging sequences are awesome. While Rhino sucks, yeah, I know. The rest of the movie, I feel, really does still carry over the same themes and weight and development. And I actually really like the Times Square scene with Electro. I found myself feeling really sorry for the guy in that film, and I actually like his portrayal here more. As wacky and as Joel Schumacher-y as it is, I really like the intention of what they do with his setup, especially nowadays. You're like, I can totally see there's a guy like this that exists in real world to a certain extent, maybe not as cartoony, but there's a version of this. I really find that all that is actually quite impactful, and I like more of it than I don't like it. Like, I think the whole thing with Peter's parents, not really necessary, but I don't mind it too much. The death of Gwen Stacy is beautifully captured. There's a reason why I feel like in No Way Home, when he saves MJ, that hits a million times harder, because that scene is perfectly executed, even in spite of the fact of being like, why is Green Goblin in this movie?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And hey, we reached our first instance of overlap. That's my number 5 as well. And for a lot of the same reasons, there's a level of tedium that this movie also verges on, but instead of being like ultra saturated, kind of chaotic patchwork tedium, it's more of a just heaviness tedium. I don't dislike Jamie Foxx's Max Dillon. I like the way he threw himself into that character, even if I don't always love the way the movie uses that character or puts music to that character. I do think the word motif is a little funky. But yeah, there is a lot of like great dramatic work, and it does have more of a tonal consistency than, say, Spider-Man 3. And it still feels like it's authored by Mark Webb, even though it is a huge, money-making blockbuster. It still feels like it's continuing on a genuine vision. And it's part of the thing that sort of helped me realize that Spider-Man in a lot of ways is like the MCU, the Marvel Batman, because it is the one that's always an event when somebody gets to reboot them or reimagine them, and always brings along a certain film style that's distinct. And that's part of why this does land higher than the other ones, is because it does still seem to have a distinct voice at play, even if that voice is somewhat distorted or held down by too much stuff going on.
Number 4 for me, this one really shocked me on my rewatch that it went down to 4, is Spider-Man 1. With Tobey Maguire. I think for nostalgia purposes, yeah, at the time it was like the perfect film that it needed to be. As time has gone on, as comic book movies have evolved, it's like the way to really appreciate that movie, I feel, and you might not agree with this, is to place yourself in the time of when it came out. However, looking at it for me right now, I do think they try doing way too much. I respect it in the sense that it kind of moves at the pace of like a graphic novel. Feels the most comic booky out of the Sam Raimi ones, and it moves at the pace of one, but that also I feel like kind of hinders the movie, where they do have like a gazillion scenes in this movie, and a lot of them don't take the time to breathe or be a little bit extra patient. They're covering so much time, and they're doing so much in the movie. It's funny enough, is I feel like Kirsten Dunst, her best performance in the Raimi films is actually Spider-Man 3. I think that's when she does her absolute best in all 3 of them. In 1 and 2, I don't really like Mary Jane.
Okay.
And I don't really like the acting of James Franco. And I'm not even talking about James Franco as a human being, which is really questionable, but just his performance in these movies, that I don't really care for that. But I still place it higher than others I listed, is because this movie, I truly just think is a blast to watch. I absolutely love Tobey Maguire in it. Despite some of the things I felt about the pacing, I thoroughly enjoy Sam Raimi's whimsical comic style. The Danny Elfman score is beautiful. Rosemary Harris is excellent. J.K. Simmons as Jay Jonah is beyond perfect casting, and it's got such an earnest, campy spirit with some truly gripping sequences. Plus, Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin is insanely iconic, and there's just so much that I do love that it outweighs the things I don't enjoy as much anymore.
All right, number 4. I'm just gonna go with what feels right, and I'm gonna say that is The Amazing Spider-Man. Like I said, this list was really hard to compile. There are different reasons why I would move these all across the board, but this was a big, not surprise, because I remember enjoying it the first time around, but upon rewatch, there was less even that stood out to me as being, a gripe. And yeah, I really, really like Andrew Garfield's portrayal of the character, as well as Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy. Like, their chemistry is unmatched, I think, across the Spider-Man films, and for that reason, even now, I'm kind of regretting regretting putting this at number 4, but I'm already locked in. Even thinking back, I was like, the Peter's parent stuff, but I even like that in this movie, whereas in the second movie, it kind of starts to get to be too much. I like the family environment they draw around Peter and the different look that you get where, they are struggling and there is dysfunction between May and Ben and Peter and all that, and you do feel, a lot of the hurt at the core of Spider-Man. While the Dr. Connors story could certainly be more fleshed out and more interesting, a la some of the other, villain performances, especially in the Sam Raimi films, I do think that it's at least pretty decent, and Rhys Ifans shows up, and I appreciated, where the story ultimately led, everything with Captain Stacy. I think it's a really solid, really good Spider-Man movie.
I would say for my number 3, it would have to be Spider-Man No Way Home. I've seen this movie 3 times now. It's good to watch it, I think, a few times where you don't feel like you're manipulated by crowd experience, so you really know how you feel about the film. Because if I was just going off crowd experience, I'd be like, number 1 easily. While I think the last half is almost near perfect for this film, and you guys have heard us talk extensively about this, while I think Tom Holland, this is absolutely his best portrayal he's ever done of Peter Parker, and this movie certainly moves me to tears every single time I watch it, I think it's really just the fact of the first half, not all of it, just aspects of the villains. We talked about this more extensively in our spoiler talk review. I thought they could have been a little bit more interesting. Like, while Green Goblin, I think, completely outdoes what he does in Spider-Man 1, there are aspects that I've already talked extensively about with the first half of this film that I don't have an issue with the way it's necessarily paced. I really have more issues with the way how some of it is ultimately executed. I didn't find like the villain interaction to be all that interesting amongst them. Almost every time I watched them, it was a bit of a letdown. Like, I really love Green Goblin a lot. I like Doc Ock because I like Alfred Molina, but like the portrayal itself, I'm not a huge fan of. I actually think Jamie Foxx is better in Amazing Spider-Man 2 and Electro, and like you got all these villains, and like the last half I think is almost near perfect. While I love a lot of that first half, ultimately that's the only thing that, because I love this movie, that's the only thing that edges it to number 3. And while the other 2 are edging out, like literally this is more of a case of what are the things that would make it a little bit lower than 1 or 2.
Absolutely. And also, how much do you factor in what came before it? Because without those things, it wouldn't exist or work. This was tough. And number 3 for me is also No Way Home. And I considered flopping it for number 4, partly because, let's get it out of the way, this movie took me back to that feeling that is so rare as an adult to have when you're at the theaters of being like, oh wow, they're doing something I didn't think I'd see realized on screen. That's beautiful. And there are, I think, some moments, a lot of moments that really soar in terms of emotional resonance, and especially for Tom Holland's Spider-Man, it's easily the best work he's done in that character amongst already good work from him specifically. But yeah, this made me emotional multiple times. It got me, cheering and hooping and hollering. Like, as an experience, every time I've seen it, which is 3 times to this point, it's really swept me up. And the only reason I really deliberated on it is because in ways I think it is kind of sloppy, especially with the villains and especially just with the handling of the spell and a lot of the sci-fi mystical mumbo jumbo. A lot of that does feel like mumbo jumbo, and a lot of it does feel like it's really easy to poke holes and just ask these weird questions about. And I think that is a fair point. Like, I think The Amazing Spider-Man is a little more consistent of a movie in that regard. However, this has some of my favorite moments from all 3 Spider-Men, and it was just so gratifying to see that they put their heart and they put their attention on the most important aspects, and they made all of those work. And for that reason, it's number 3 for me.
You gotta understand, guys, we usually like deep dive about all these movies individually, so we're trying to sum this all up in like 1 minute of why it's here on the list.
Comprehensive but quick.
Number 2 for me would have to be The Amazing Spider-Man. Before, this was closer to the bottom, but upon rewatch, I love this movie. I think it's absolutely excellent. It's hard to make a realistic Spider-Man movie because that's just impossible. Just by the nature of its character, it's not going to be realistic. For what they go for, it does feel like the closest to what you can do with realism for portraying Peter Parker. I think Andrew Garfield, upon rewatching this, I never thought I would say this, but he actually knocked off Tobey Maguire for me when doing the rewatch of these films solely due to The Amazing Spider-Man, because I think he is so believable and so so human in the film, and he does carry all this energy and weird eccentricities, but also brings such gravitas as well. And he feels just like a real struggling dude. And yeah, him and Gwen Stacy, absolutely. I actually really love the action a lot in this film. While I think overall, stylistically, sure, Sam Raimi would have the edge on it. I think what they did here with it's more of a gritty, like, I don't think it's as like grim as people used to paint it to be. While there's some grim moments for sure, I think like the way they handle the relationships, like with Uncle Ben, I think is so beautifully done. Aunt May, the final scene at the end with giving the egg. Captain Stacy in this movie, that scene at the dinner table when you're realizing how this whole time he's just on a revenge quest, and he doesn't really evolve into Spider-Man until he saves that kid on the freeway when he gives him the mask. I'm like, wow, this is something so beautiful, and it's funny. I really love just how much this movie takes its time. It has a really nice gradual build and pace. I love how much of the scientist side of Peter Parker is kept alive in both this film and Amazing Spider-Man 2. I really think the drama sometimes hits really hard. The whole experience just feels very human. I love that movie. I honestly am like, yeah, number 2 was easy as hell for me to figure out. Yeah, this list was really easy for me to put together.
Good. We're the yin and the yang, because every step of the way I was like, oh God, I could put. And so for me, number 2, again, was a toughie. I'm basically splitting it between brain and heart, and going for number 2, I would say is objectively, probably, arguably the best Spider-Man live action adaptation. It's Spider-Man 2. I can't really say a lot about why it's not number 1, because yeah, it's terrific. It's got some of the highest emotional highs. It realizes one of Spider-Man's most iconic villains in Doc Ock. There are some incredible scenes with Rosemary Harris as Aunt May. It's got some of arguably better, Harry and Mary Jane stuff is okay-ish. Overall, that movie soars and really nails and realizes both just what the live-action Spider-Man movie could be, and also it's one of the last times I can imagine Sam Raimi helming a movie as big and scopic and expensive and high production value as that, and it really feeling like, yeah, this was his vision. This is a guy who's really charged up about this material, and yeah, seeing the growth of Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker and everything, it's a terrific movie. And watching it again, I was like, man, this still has every cylinder I remember firing 100%.
Yeah, I mean, obviously number 1 is still Spider-Man 2 for me. That hasn't been edged off. I really think that obviously everything that you said, but I think this film beautifully captures the whole thing about, Peter Parker and the main struggle that he has, which is how to be Peter Parker and be Spider-Man. Yeah. And this movie, I think, excellently does that. And I think this is easily Tobey Maguire's best performance out of the Sam Raimi trilogy. His subtlety and comedic moments with just like expressions, he can do a lot with a little. While I do think on the rewatch, I was like, okay, he kind of doesn't have his powers for a little too long in this movie. Like, it goes on a while. Yeah. When it gets to that, the buildup of when he does get his powers back and goes to fight Doc Ock, nothing is more pulsating to me than that. Like, that is such a gripping moment. I feel like every single shot in Spider-Man 2 is so goddamn composed. Everything is so freaking thought out. Whereas I felt a little bit more like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 1 moved a little bit like a comic book. This one moved a little bit more like a film meets a graphic novel. In terms of the way that aesthetic was done. And while I still don't really care for Mary Jane in the movie, I do find the last bits pretty heartwarming and endearing with them. It really does feel like cinema to me.
Especially.
I love the hell out of Spider-Man 2. And I would still personally place the whole second fight with Doc Ock leading to the whole train sequence to be the best fight scene in comic book movies, from all the emotions it evokes to the camera work, staging, and choreography. There was a hot minute where I was like, is Amazing Spider-Man 1 taking for me? But no, it definitely still be Spider-Man 2.
Well, then that just leaves number 1 for me, which is, the original Spider-Man. And I again...
Never got better than that.
I mean, no, I think Spider-Man 2 is the superior film, and especially the marriage of digital and practical effects for Doc Ock is incredible. But when I, just waved my sort of heart meter over every slot in this list, the moments that are the most ingrained to me, I kept thinking of these moments, and I was like, damn, so many of the most iconic Spider-Man motion picture moments to me come from the original Spider-Man. And yeah, it is absolutely a personal choice.
A nostalgia choice.
In a sense, yeah, and just watching it again, I still, for some reason, for me, I still emotionally pang and resonate with that iteration of Peter a heck of a lot. Like, I feel myself quite, sort of, I don't know, affected or harmonizing in a way when I watch that, and seeing the early stages, the budding stages, as he's trying to kind of talk to Mary Jane, and as they're still learning how to communicate with each other, he's learning his powers, he's changing, everything with, going after Uncle Ben's killer and everything. Just, there's so much in that movie that resonates a lot still. I like the comic book pacing and the comic book coloring and everything. Like, yeah, it does feel more comic booky, or like it rests on that more than, say, a Spider-Man 2. But I really appreciate that. I like all the fun flourishes, the Randy Savage and Bruce Campbell and all that. Norman Osborn's Green Goblin still is iconic in my mind, as is Doc Ock. But yeah, just there's something about his portrayal of that villain, that presence left such an impression on me then, and I think is still really compelling now, and also then has that really great payoff in No Way Home, whereas, Doc Ock kind of continues and helps out, but it's not as, emotionally, fist punching as that. So for various reasons, it's still my favorite.
I like the comic book pace, but at the same time, I was like, maybe slow it down a little bit.
That's fair. I think it also, too, really hits that sense of discovery and wonder.
Yeah. There's no argument with that.
Yeah,
I still like the film a lot. Yeah. All right, guys. Well, what is your ranking? Tell us why Greg is wrong in the comments and why John is 100% right, as always, guys. Subscribe, click that bell, hit that like button, and hey, we will catch you all soon.